Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Nick, I'm your host, and in today's episode, I talk with Jared Massey. Jared and I talk about children's ministry in a small church, but if you lead in youth ministry, many of the things that we talk about would apply there as well, really would apply to any ministry in a small church setting. So we asked Jared what a small church is, what does that mean, what size, and he talks about that, some of the unique strengths of a small church and some of the challenges of leading in a small church. Before we jump into that interview, though, just want to remind you that we're coming up on 1 year of the podcast. Next week will be the 52nd episode, so that'll be 1 year completed. And we're going to have a special Q&A episode after that. So if you have any questions that we haven't been able to hit with guests and things like that, be sure to email them at nick@nickblevins.com or hit me up on Twitter @nickblevins, or you can even go right on the site and leave a voice message with your question there. Be sure to say who you are and where you're from when you leave that question. And we'll hit a bunch of those questions in that special episode. And then there's a great episode, an interview I just did recently, to kick off kind of the new season, the new year. And you don't want to miss that, so that'll be a lot of fun. It'll be our first repeat guest. We're going to give away a bunch of stuff that week of the anniversary, so be sure to check out the podcast and the blog and the Facebook page and just all of those places, because we'll give away some different stuff on each of those platforms, so you don't want to miss that. As usual, you can get all the links and resources that we talk about in the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 51. Jared mentioned some resources and books that'd be helpful if you are in a small church setting. But let's go ahead now and jump into my conversation with Jared. Well, Jared Massey is joining us today on the podcast. Welcome, Jared.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me.
You bet. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and your church?
So I am married to my high school sweetheart. We've been together since I was 15, and she was my first serious girlfriend. So I'd had a couple, elementary school, hold hands at recess for a minute, but
checking boxes.
Yeah. But she was my first serious girlfriend, and so I'm thrilled to have known her since we were in first grade. We were friends growing up. We went to school together. So anyway, I'm married to her, and she is wonderful. She's pretty incredible. And then together we have 3 children. We have 2 boys, and then a little 1.5-year-old daughter, who we say has completed our family. She just kind of rounded out the rough edges of raising 2 boys.
Nice.
And she is all girl, loves 1.5, loves to have her toenails painted, and you won't see her without a necklace on. So she's all girl, and we love her for it. So her mom is thrilled. So together we live in a small town in Illinois, right on the Mississippi, and it's not far from where my wife and I grew up. So we get to be around our family, which is nice. But it's a very rural community. Farming and manufacturing would be the 2 main sources of income around here. A lot of factories and a lot of big farms. So in planting season and harvesting season, you can just expect you're going to get stuck behind a truck going way slower than you want to go. And that's just our life. So we love it. So we've been here in ministry for about almost 9 years, just shy of 9 years at this point. And it's our first ministry assignment. But I've been actively involved in ministry about as long as I've been with my wife. So for about 16 years now.
Awesome. So what town are you in specifically? Not that I'll know it, but.
That's all right. It's a little town called Warsaw. There's about 1,600 people. And I like to give people perspective of our community. In the entire county that we live in, there are 2 stoplights, and they're not in the town we live in. So we're one of the maybe smaller towns in the community, but it's just every town in the community is small. So it's just it's a very rural, small town surrounded by small towns.
That's awesome. So I don't know my Illinois geography that well, but our latest church planting resident is from Normal, Illinois. So
sure.
If you know of that and how far it is and all
that.
I just love the name. I'm from Normal. Yeah, that's great. As
Normal.
opposed, you're clearly from not Normal, Illinois.
Exactly.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah. Normal's in Central Illinois, so it's about 3.5 hours from us. We're on. If you stand on a point in our town and look across the river, you look into Iowa. But if you just turn just slightly to your left, you'll look into Missouri. So we're right on the Missouri, Iowa, Illinois border.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, obviously being in a small town, 1,600 people, a lot of people listening probably can't relate to that. They're thinking, that was like my high school.
Yeah.
But a lot of people listening can relate to that. And one thing you're passionate about, and it's your setting, is small churches and helping children's ministry leaders do children's ministry well in a small church setting. So what has made you passionate about that? Is it just serving in it? I imagine it's more than that. I imagine it's some conversations and work, talking with other leaders who are in that context as well, or just looking to connect.
Yeah. So the passion for ministry, children's ministry, started when I was about 12 years old, and I was serving in my small children's church. And I helped one Sunday morning, and I went home and I said, Mom, I feel like this is something I could do for the rest of my life. And by that, I meant just help in children's ministry. And she just asked me, just matter of factly, she says, do you mean like a children's pastor? Which I had never heard of. I didn't meet my first children's pastor until I was 18. And so I didn't even know that was a thing. But when she said those words, it was just like everything in my whole body and spirit lit up. Like I knew that was going to be who I was going to be from that age. And so for the rest of my life from that point on, I just kind of dove in and every chance I got to learn about children's ministry, I did. I took over my church's children's ministry when I was 16 completely. I organized volunteers. I developed programming, just all of it. And so then when we went away to college, my intention when I went to college for children's ministry was to land in a big church somewhere, because in my mind, those were the only churches that had children's pastors. And I knew that was what I was supposed to do. So I was training so that I could get a full-time job in children's ministry, and just expected to go to a big church somewhere. And my junior year of college, at my college, one of their focus, their mission statement said they were a church with an urban and international focus. So we were a little bit out of place anyway, because it was in downtown Minneapolis, and we were a little out of our element. But every year they did an urban focus week. Every year they did an international missions week. And every other year they did a small town ministry focus. Every other year. And at one of those chapels, I heard the speaker, and it was like that fire lit inside of me again. And I told my wife, I said, I feel like we're going to end up in a small town. And she's like, I know. That's exactly what I felt too. So, long story short, at that moment, I knew I would end up somehow in a small town. And all 4 years of college, we served in a large 3,000 member church, got involved there. I loved the excellence of ministry. I mean, they just did everything so well. And so then my heart became, how do we take this excellence, this just doing things well and strategically, but how do we take that back to small towns where churches really are just kind of, my children's leader for most of my life was my grandma, who just kind of showed up and taught a lesson, and she loved ministry, but there was no strategy. There was no necessarily excellence. She was just doing what she knew to do. And so, when we graduated college, we ended up here in Warsaw. And since then, we've just poured ourselves into how do we do children's ministry well in our context, but more than that, how do we take everything we've learned and train others to do the same thing? And so those kind of dual things have become just my everything. And so that's kind of that's the condensed but still fairly long version of how my passion came about.
That's awesome. And like you said, you're focusing on doing it well in your church, but also helping others. And so before we kind of jump into what that looks like, because that's the goal here, is just to talk through, some tips or best practices or whatever to help people understand what that can look like in a small church setting. And I think obviously some people listening are in that context. Others might be in like a big church, but it's a multi-site church. So they have campuses that are small versus they might have the church you went to is 3,000 or whatever, and the church that's 100 because they have a campus, and somehow they have to blend, both worlds.
Right.
So this can be helpful to them as well. But before we jump into that, how would you define small church? Because sometimes I don't know, those phrases can mean different things, and mega church is one thing or something different. So for you, what does that mean, small church?
Yeah, so I've had people say to me, I'm in a small church too. And then when we get to talking, I realize they have 1,500 people. But they're not a 10,000 person church. So in their mind, they're a small church. Yeah. And I just chuckle because I'm like, that's my whole town, you know?
Yeah, that's everybody in the place.
So, and sometimes you get take a little personal, like you have no idea. But so what, for my purposes, and I think these numbers are fairly generally accepted when we talk about small churches, is you're talking your 300 and under would be classified as a small church. And then if you get to 100 and under, they've even adopted, I didn't come up with this, but I like the term micro church. Now, micro meaning in numerically, but not in impact, because what we find statistically is that a large majority of churches are in that 300 or under, and actually even a majority of churches still find themselves in the 100 and under. So when you're talking about the churches that need to hear this, you're actually talking about most churches find themselves in that numerical range. Some just because they're church plants just getting started, some because geographically where they are, they're in small communities like I am, and some are just, a variety of reasons they've found themselves in that number range. So I like to say 300 and under, but that 100 and under even has some unique challenges to them, and I very much understand those. So I try to pour myself into them when I can.
Yeah, and that's your setting, right? Your church would fit into that under 100 micro church setting.
Yeah, we have hit 100 only on a few special services. Generally, we run between average attendance, I'll say 65. You know how church attendance is; it varies a lot. And in a small church, one family can be 6 people, so that can definitely impact your attendance. But we are in the micro church range, definitely.
So what are some of the strengths or advantages a small church has that are probably overlooked? I mean, for somebody who's listening and that's not their setting, this might be news to them. Like maybe they've never had that experience if they grew up in churches that were a little larger. Or for someone who is listening and that's their setting, but they've only been thinking about, the barriers, which we'll talk about that as well. What are some of the advantages that should be tapped into and really used that really only small churches have?
Yeah, so small churches have so many opportunities that aren't available in a large church. In fact, I once sort of had a discussion with Kenny Conley, who's a children's pastor he's a next gen guy now, but at the time he was a children's leader in a fairly large church. And he said small churches are always trying to get bigger, but big churches are always trying to get smaller. And what he meant by that was there are unique advantages that are only found in small churches. And the bigger you get, you begin to lose those. And he was talking about trying to recapture some of those advantages, like that ability to know, not just, oh, I think that person goes to my church, but to know them, to know especially your volunteers and your leaders, to know their children, to know, what their passions are, what, not just like, oh, I love this ministry, but to also know that that person loves to ride motorcycles on the weekend, or to know that that person has a retro car that they're fixing up, or to know that that person, is an avid Cubs fan, or whatever it is. You begin to really know people intimately, which helps drive your conversation to them. In our church, specifically, one of our strategies is just to make church feel as much like home as possible, and to make the people feel as much like family as possible. And I think that small churches really are uniquely positioned to do that well, where large churches have to fight for that. Small churches, it's almost natural.
Sure.
And so anyway, I would say that those two things, knowing intimately people, and then also just that when people walk in, they just feel like, man, we just came home. I think those are two special strengths.
Yeah, and in children's ministry, you probably know all the kids the same way. You don't just know their names, which is one thing, but you know more about all of them, right?
Yeah, and so now this is not specific to small church; it's more small community here. But I actually know the name of every first grader and every preschooler in my town.
That's awesome.
So when I walk into my elementary school, and I know a number of, kids from all the age groups, but because I have a child in kindergarten and I have a child in preschool, or excuse me, not kindergarten, first grade. But I know the name of every first grader in my town, and that's 25 kids. So, take that for what it's worth. But at the same time, think about the ability that I have uniquely to connect with the kids in my community, that a large church, especially in a large city, they just don't have that ability.
Yeah, definitely. Even if you're talking about helping them plug into your church, if they don't go to church or something like that. But I imagine that's all, well, a lot of that too. Where if people are part of a church, if they're part of another church in town, or if they're not, you probably know a lot more about them than, a larger church might when they just show up on Sunday.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's an ability to know people. And now if you're in a small church in a big city, what I've found is the best strategy they can take is to, rather than try to reach the whole city, try to reach the community around them. And I think they can find that those type of strengths still work in their context. So even though, oh man, we're in a huge city, but if they focus on the neighborhood around their church, they'll find they have the ability to plug into that one school, to plug into those individual families and, maybe the little league in that community, and just to really go deep with a few and then disciple the few to continue to reach their context. And you'll find in small town, big town, wherever you are, you'll find that often is the most effective strategy anyway.
Yeah, I see even in I see with like church plants or even larger churches that are in bigger cities, they're finding power in that kind of focus. Instead of trying to help 20 community partners, let's pick one school or two schools or something like that.
Yeah.
When it feels like they are, leaving out a ton of other options, but it seems like people are getting a lot more traction when they do that. Kind of like you're saying, put a lot of focus on one thing. Are there other advantages for small churches that we want to talk about before we jump into like some of the barriers that come up?
Sure. Well, there are always going to be the barriers, and I know we're going to move into that, of like time and money and all that stuff. But what a small church has is, in the same regard, is you don't have as large of facilities. So you're not managing, a lot of facilities. Sometimes you're in a shared facility even. And so there's a lot of overhead that you can remove out of your day-to-day management. There are a number. So just in facilities alone, there's some real advantages there, even though at times small environments may feel like a restriction. When I talk to people in larger churches and I hear all of the things they spend their time worrying about, and I realize I don't have any of those worries, I realize just how much of an advantage I have being in a small church. So take those maybe barriers and realize that sometimes they're actually an advantage in disguise. You just, again, with all of those things, with time, with volunteers, even with your money, you have the ability in a small church to go deeper in fewer things versus broader in trying to be all things to all people.
Yeah. And you kind of, what you said there, definitely makes sense in that the larger a church gets, this is going to make it sound bad, and I don't mean to make it sound bad, but the reality is there's more red tape. There's more meetings, there are more policies, there's more processes, there are more other people and what they're doing that you have to account for in your own planning, versus you're right, in a small church, you know everything that's going on. And so there's not, you don't have to spend as much time doing all those other things. You can spend more time on the things you specifically wanted to do. They're going to impact your ministry and help the church and all that. That's true. That's a good point.
And you hit on something really kind of huge that I was missing, but the ability to be mobile quickly is a small church advantage. If there's a need that I recognize, I can almost immediately respond to it, or I might have to go through at the very most, I have to go through my board, which is only 3 people. I can literally call them all and have a conversation that lasts less than 10 minutes. And so when I need to respond to a need in my community, I have a huge advantage over a large church. In fact, they say, and by they, I just have read multiple times, that small churches are actually the first responders to needs in their community, often because they don't have to meet a committee. They don't have to get all the staff on board. The pastor sees a need, he responds to the need. And so oftentimes small churches can respond more quickly than a large church. Even though our response may be smaller, we might bring less to the table. Our ability to do that quickly means that we can work in partnership with the large churches to actually fully meet the need, which I think is awesome when you think about it that way.
Yeah, and what people need most of the time is care. So church size doesn't matter. What matters is who shows up. It doesn't matter what church you're from, what size it is. And it makes me think of a time when our church, kind of like Kenny Conley says, when you're small, you want to get larger. When you're larger, you want to get small. We had to have a conversation with staff about how we were not necessarily responding in the way we needed to with certain pastoral care things because we were leaning too much into process or, again, red tape being the bad version of that. And it was one of those things where like, hey, we got mixed up here. That can't apply here. When it comes to other things, I don't know, a budget request or an approval or something, sure, let's follow the process and all that. But when it's about care, we skip that. We say yes and we move and we try to move quickly. But you're right. That was an example of like, man, we just got into a habit where people made some assumptions that we should operate the same way here as we do there. And that wasn't true. And so that's big. That's important.
Yeah. And I mean, no disrespect to large churches at all in that statement at all. Cause I get, but large church pastors, oftentimes their schedules are more, rigid in that they do have regular meetings. They do have all of these things that they're in charge of, and they kind of have to have that rigidness in order to continue to do well. But in my particular context, my schedule is very fluid. So when I get a phone call that someone's in the hospital, 9 times out of 10, I can leave immediately, and I don't have to reschedule anything. And so just a couple weeks ago, a lady in our church got really sick and ended up passing away, and I was able to just that day take her son down to visit and all of those things that in a large church would have been more of an inconvenience, just because of there might have been rescheduling things. So when you look at it that way, it's not that large churches are doing anything wrong necessarily. It's just that the nature of the beast kind of situation.
Yeah. And that's why I think it is important for large churches to fight to be small.
Yeah.
And in some ways, small churches are going to fight to be large, not necessarily in all the offerings, but and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And I think there's a great article. I don't know if you've read it. We'll link to it in the show notes from Tim Keller about church size culture, like how a church of 200 is so different than a church of 1,000, which is so different than a church of 5,000. And he even talks about how a Baptist church of 200 and like, let's say a Methodist or I don't know, a non-denominational church of 200 are far more alike than like the Baptist church of 200 and the Baptist church of 1,000, because the size culture matters so much that it trumps how everything else operates, just in terms of how it feels. And so I think it's important for churches to work, because you can't be large and not care for people, right? It just might have to, like in our church, for instance, if somebody calls and this happens all the time, obviously, and there's a funeral that needs to be done. Well, in a smaller church, whoever 2 or 3 people, you might be real quick talking about, okay, who's going to do it? I'll take it, whatever. And then, especially if it's an instance where maybe nobody knows the family that well. You know what I mean? Well, in a larger church, the answer is still yes, right? It's just, You just got to figure out who it is. So, I mean, ideally, you're not going through all the I don't know, checks of like who's available and who can do this. You throw all that out and you just care. And hopefully that's what happens. But you're right. It is easy to get lost in it. And I think this is just maybe this is pie in the sky for me, but I think small churches can be large in some ways. but not in every way. And I think large churches can be small in other ways, but they'll never be as good at certain things as each other. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Like the large church probably, in terms of if community to you means knowing everyone, that's never going to happen in a large church. But if community to you means you're known by 20 to 30 people and you know them really well through being in a small group and serving on a team, well, yeah, you could absolutely have more community in a large church than even a small church, maybe. You know what I mean? So that's where they cross so much.
Right.
It's not like that clean, but there are definite advantages and disadvantages. So what are some of the barriers? Like, what are some of the things that are tough for a small church and anybody that's listening that leads in that context?
So if someone, like a specific person, were to come to me and say, God wants me to, I feel like God wants me to be in ministry, I just don't know any more details. I would encourage them to dig deep into, their strengths, to pursue where God has equipped them to be successful and to walk in that. But sometimes with churches, when a church says, we just want to just minister, and they just want to minister all over the place, and they just throw up ministry all over their community. The problem is they're not actually operating in the strength that God has given them. They're just trying to be all things to all people, because they just get, as a church, they get excited about ministry. And I don't know why it's okay to tell a person you can operate in the strengths that God has given you, but to a church we expect them to be everything. And so I would say most of the barriers or the struggles that come in small church ministry happen because we try to be too much instead of focusing on what God has called our specific church to do, and recognizing that there are other churches in town, even in a small town like mine. They call Warsaw the town of 7 bars and 7 churches, because there's 7 bars and 7 churches, I guess. But there are other churches in our community that are doing things, and so why don't we let them do that well, and why don't we focus on what God has called us to do, or at least try to fill maybe some gaps where things aren't being done. So those barriers happen oftentimes because we try to do too much. And it's easy to do. I love reading ministry blogs. I love going to conferences, and I get excited about everything I hear other people doing. And I want to come home and do all of that, but I can't. I only have a finite amount of resources, and that's true. I've found this. I discovered this. It's not going to be news to you, Nick, but I discovered that even the biggest church in the world still has a finite amount of resources.
Oh, yeah. Everybody does, right?
Yeah. And I used to think that, that's a small church problem. And, oh, man, woe is me. And then I realized big churches, they have more, but they still have a finite amount. They still have to budget. They still have to not overspend. They're still restrained by that. Their restraints may give them more freedom, but at the end of the day, they still have those restraints. So I immediately took that out of my list of things to complain about.
Yeah, we have so our church is part of a network of churches that have planted new churches over the last decade. Our church was one of them, kind of the first in this new effort. And one of the churches in the network is the largest church, and I mean large church, thousands of people. And there aren't many of those where I live. But I remember the time when they were part of this new church plant, and we were approving money for them. And there was an issue where, the planter was going to go without pay because of just delays and some other things. And we all approved as churches to put in extra money, to bridge that gap. And here I knew that large church was not giving, they couldn't do anything for their staff that year in terms of salary or increases or hiring or raises or anything. And which is very common. So people are listening are thinking, yeah, that's been my church for 5 years. But you probably don't think about that with big church. And here I saw from the inside, they're not giving stuff to their people, but they are giving stuff to this other church.
Right.
Just being generous here, when it would be easy to think as the small church, well, of course you can. You're big. You have the money. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But you're right. It scales. And another example that I think of is, generally speaking, you think the larger the church, the more the staff, which is true. However, usually if you dig into it, the larger the church, the less staff they have per attender. if that makes sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that makes sense. It's sort of just natural. I mean, you could probably serve more people with the same amount of staff as you get bigger. You know, there's like that whole economies of scale thing or whatever. But you're right. You don't think about that. You think, man, that church's budget is probably a lot more than mine. If I could just get and I don't know if that ever goes away. And I guess unless you're the largest church, you're probably thinking, I'd really like to have that budget right there. You know, if your church 1,000, I want that 2,000 person church budget or volunteer base or whatever it might be. That's true. So what, in terms of the programming though, because you're saying church, one of the biggest barriers is they do too much. What are some examples of things you think a small church should do or shouldn't do? And it might even be interested in to talk about like what it looks like at your church programming wise.
Yeah. So, I mean, let me use a really common example that I think kind of hits the general idea here. In a large church, oftentimes they either have an on staff or at least a volunteer media person who's really good. Large churches find themselves with more people to pull from. So the more people you get, the higher chance that one of those people is really good at media. But in a small church, especially in my context, being a rural community, technology kind of takes a while to catch up here. And so big churches often do media really well. They have video, they have graphics, they have, their social media is always full of these beautiful images. Their website's gorgeous. And you walk in and everything is so crisp and clean and sharp and always looks great. But in a small church, if I try to do that, if I try to have the media that competes with a large church, even larger churches in my area, I'm going to find myself spending, because it's not per se a strength of mine. It's something I'm familiar with, but it's not a strength of mine. And I have yet to have someone who steps up and says, I'm really good at this and I want to do it all for you. So if I spend all my time doing that, I would spend all of my time doing that. And the rest of my programming would suffer. So we err on the side of oftentimes having no media versus doing it not well.
That's a good example, because I mean, good illustration. You could apply that to a bunch of different things, right? Rather than do that and have it not be what we want, we're just not going to do it.
Right, exactly. It's just media is an easy example for me because it is something I see. I see churches sometimes that spend so much time on making cool graphics for their sermon titles that they forget about content for their sermons. And you realize, man, this person, if he would have not done the graphic and would have just focused on having an incredible sermon, his depth would have actually gone farther anyway. And so in my church, I try to use curriculums that help me in that area, because God has gifted me with to be able to speak in public, and so it's not something that's ever scared me or anything like that. So when it comes to developing content for kids ministry, man, I could almost do that in my sleep. And so that's where I focus my effort, is making sure I'm delivering great content, instead of focusing on things that I'm maybe less good at. So I look for curriculum that meets me. Maybe the content isn't as strong, but the media is incredible. And so now we've met in the middle.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because I would imagine, because you're saying you use a curriculum, because another temptation might be to write your own, because maybe a budget wouldn't allow you to afford curriculums you want. But then you have that tension of, well, then how much of your time is going to writing curriculum? Right?
Yeah, I spent my first couple of years at this church writing my own curriculum. When I started, just a little context, when I started, we had one baby in the nursery. That was the only child in our whole church. Wow. And so there were about 12 or 13 people. They were all over the age of 60. And I was hired for a very low salary, basically a parsonage, and not even hardly enough money to live off of or to eat off of. And so I had a second job full time for a lot of years. But I was hired on faith, and I spent the first 2 years with zero budget. And so I wrote everything. But what I found was I was spending so much of my limited time just picking out what stories I wanted to tell. And then I had not as much time left to actually tell them well. And so at that point, our church was beginning to grow. And I went to the board and said, here's the curriculum I'd like to purchase. Here's the cost. And here's the advantage, is that instead of spending all of my time just figuring out what I want to teach, now I just take what they tell me and I teach it how I want to teach. And I will say that was one of the smartest decisions I ever made. And I because it freed me up to do what I do really well. So that's kind of my story of how I started using curriculum, but I can't imagine going back to without it, just for time reasons, just for what it affords me in time.
Sure. Well, now you filled that time with other things. So you pay for curriculum now, because that was one of the questions I had. One of the benefits that we've seen probably just in the last 15 years, but certainly the last decade or even 5 years of large churches is they're giving away stuff, which is great.
Yeah.
So do you recommend, like a lot of children's ministry leaders in smaller churches look for, free curriculum like Life Church or whatever it might be, where they can, it has all the graphics and all that stuff, and you're going to tweak it like you do almost anything. I think any of those of us that use curriculum know that pretty much all of it gets adapted. So if you're going to adjust something, maybe something that's free. Do you usually recommend that? Sounds like you pay for something.
Yeah, I pay for something, and I love what I use. I use Orange in both my children's ministry and my youth ministry, and I love them because of a lot of reasons. But I would absolutely tell anybody, even if you're using a free curriculum, to do something that helps guide you. Now, if there's specific things that, because of your denomination, because of your church's vision, or maybe just you specifically, there's something really valuable to you, feel free to give yourself 1 or 2 months out of the year to teach away from the curriculum. That's totally fine. But to have a curriculum that kind of guides you, it's helpful to you as a leader, because you're not spending all of your time just on the generics. You can really focus in on the specifics. So, and like you said, there is some incredible stuff available today for free or next to nothing. Churches have been, these large churches have been so generous to say, we're creating good stuff. Why don't we just give it away? And I love that, because that wasn't available even when I started 9 years ago, and especially when I really started 15 years ago. That wasn't the case. The internet, wasn't what it is now, and so it's a great strategy for you to say, this curriculum aligns with 90% of what we want to teach anyway, so why don't we just adopt it?
Yeah, definitely. I know. So you may have some other barriers, and I'd love to talk about those. But one I wanted to ask you about, and I know you hear about it all the time too, is recruiting volunteers. So people will listen to, any of the number of other podcasts that I've recorded with people where I asked them about how do you recruit volunteers, what are some, tips or things to keep in mind and all that stuff. But questions I'll get oftentimes will say, I'm in a small church. How do you recruit volunteers in a smaller church where the issue could be that everyone, right? Or just that whole idea that maybe there's just not enough people, whatever it might be. So what would you say to someone who just regularly has a volunteer recruitment issue and they're in a small church? What's specific, to their context and how they can do that well?
Sure. Well, one of the advantages to recruiting volunteers in a small church is that it becomes less about a questionnaire and more about the questions. And what I mean by that is, in a small church, because you know people well, you can ask those very specific questions that says, hey, you run a daycare, so you're obviously great with children, but is that something you want to do on another day of the week? And we have cases where people say, I work with kids all week, I don't want to do it on Sunday. And then we have cases where people say, I work with kids all week and can't wait to do it again on Sunday. That's a question that isn't always answered on a questionnaire, but it's answered in a conversation and a question. And so that's one strategy, is just asking people questions that get to the heart of things, not just assuming, well, this is their career, therefore it's obviously where they want to volunteer. And the second thing that I would say recommend to people as you're recruiting in a small church is don't let what you know about someone disqualify them. You will be surprised at who does well with kids. You'll be surprised at who has a heart for children's ministry. But you'll also be surprised by children's ministry is what I know the best. But in any area, you'll find that in conversations with people, you go, wow, this person mentioned that. Let's unpack that a little more. And you'll find some volunteers, even in your church, in a small church, in unlikely places. You'll find people who are uniquely gifted in unlikely things, and taking those people and using them where God has gifted them. Oftentimes, the first time they do it, they will just light up, and you will realize that you have woken a sleeping giant, and that person that you might have initially overlooked their potential because of what you knew about them. When you allow them to unpack that, you'll find that they become very good volunteers in unlikely areas.
So a lot of it, don't make the assumptions, but then it sounds like have the conversation versus maybe in a larger church, we may get stuck on. And I think this is a barrier too for recruitment in a larger church is you view it too much from like the macro level. You're looking at numbers and processes and ways people can sign up on their own, right? Versus in a smaller church, you could do that, but your best play is to go talk to people, right? And to get to know them, ask questions. That's true. And I think that could benefit larger churches as well. But in a smaller church, that's probably how you have to do it, is to have those conversations. Don't make assumptions, right?
Yeah. And the best conversations don't happen at church. You know how this is. Sunday mornings, if you want me to know something, don't tell me on Sunday morning. I will forget it. And so oftentimes we try to have conversations with people, potential volunteers and things, and on Sunday mornings, because that's when we're together. But the best conversations happen at Little League games. The best conversations happen, when you're bowling, or one of the things the guys in our church love to go, like trap shooting and things. And the best conversations happen not at church, because it's in those moments when people aren't talking church language, they're not signing up for things that God hasn't gifted them for. When you're at church on a Sunday morning and you see a need, out of obligation, you may feel like, well, I could maybe help with that. But when you're on a Monday night and you're just hanging out and you're talking about what hobbies you enjoy or what things you love, that's when you find what people really are called to, and they're not just signing up for because it's an obligation. And I would say, too, going back to an earlier conversation here, if you're finding that it's impossible to recruit volunteers for a specific program, that's when you really need to get real with God and say, is this a program that we're supposed to have right now? Because I find oftentimes God gives us a lack just to get us to let things die. It's not about killing programs. Sometimes it's about just letting something die. It's struggling along, it's limping along, and God's saying, I have something so much better for you, and you're over here tending to a sick horse. So just let that thing go. Let it have peace. It served its time. But here's the new thing. And we found that happen in our church. At times we found that things just had to die on their own. But when they did, and we allowed them, instead of fighting for them, when we allowed them to die, we found that God opened doors to new ministry that we didn't see.
That's good. And I would imagine, I grew up in a church that would not have fit the small church definition here, but just barely. It was 400 people. And when I was a young adult, I did a study just to see, like, because I'd heard 80% of the people or 20% of the people do 80% of the work, that whole thing. Right. But I thought our church is small enough that I could figure that out. Like, this was probably, I don't know, this is before we had a church management system, so to speak, but it's not like we put everything in there, so you couldn't just look up how many people were serving. And a lot of churches still, probably don't have anything like that. But if your church is small enough, you can just do it by asking the right questions and talking to the right people. And I found out we had, in a church of 400, the rule generally applied. There were 80 people who were mostly serving and different roles and things like that. Now, of course, that 400 included kids, who weren't going to serve. But We also had, if you added up ministries, committees, just ongoing things that you could be a team, part of a team to serve in. We had 72 or 74, I don't remember, something like that, things. And so quickly it was like, wow, we almost have like a thing, like a ministry or a recurring event or a committee per person, and it's not a wonder that we can't recruit volunteers because we're all competing, for the same small group of people.
Right.
And there's just too many things. So I could see where that would be an action step if volunteer recruitment's difficult in your church, even if it's a little bit larger, that could be the issue. Is that you just don't realize it, but there are too many things, right?
Yeah, and I feel like just this last year, I felt like God kind of giving me permission. I've done this not just in small churches since I was a little kid, but I've also been trying to resource people now for about 8 years, and I feel like God has finally just told me this year, you have my permission to release people from ministry. And what I mean by that is I feel like God's saying that I have the ability to give people permission to not do it all, and just to look people in the eye to say, listen, you don't have to do everything, because sometimes we feel like, man, I gotta do it. We've got to have that program. We've got to do that thing. And not only do we have to do it, we have to do it well. So we have to, and I feel like God has equipped me this year to just look people and say, listen, you have God's permission to not do all the things, but to do the things that he's called you to, just really do those things really well. And I'm kind of enjoying walking in that. It's something I've embraced this year because I feel like when you say that to people, at first they look at you like you're joking. And then when they realize you're serious, you just see that sigh of relief, like they get it. Like, oh, God really doesn't expect everything from me. Even, the 12 disciples, you look at them in the days or in the years following Jesus's ascension, and none of them did everything. They all did different things, and they all went to different ministries, and then they recruited people to help in areas where they weren't. But if you just look at the 12 disciples, you realize none of them did everything. They all had a very specific job or specific jobs that they did. And then they let other people do the rest. And so let's take some permission from them in their lives.
That's good advice. And then even collectively, it's not like they did everything that, just like a church. Even individually, you can't do everything, but even as a church, if you're sharing things and together you're doing a lot, even as a church, you can't do everything. Like my church, I felt like, man, we could literally cut this list in half and still have a hard time putting volunteers in all these things. You know what I mean? That would have been tough. How about, are there any resources that you'd recommend if they serve in a small church, almost any role, children's ministry, youth ministry, whatever it might be? Is there anything that's been helpful to you that you would recommend?
Yeah, there's one resource that I want to throw out there, especially. This is more for churches in small communities, but it's called Rural Compassion, ruralcompassion.org. And it is a ministry that is really good about equipping churches in these kind of farming communities like I'm in, with the resources they need to do some really cool stuff. And so they will bring in a semi-trailer of supplies that you can do like a serve day for your community. And they have, the reason I throw them out there specifically though, is they have a lot of guides on like the 100 best evangelism tools in a small church, or great ways to reach out to your community in a small context. And so anyway, Rural Compassion is one that I've used some of their stuff, and I just love their heart for the small church. So they're one. Another one is a book for those that like to read books. There's a book by Carl Vaders called The Grasshopper Myth. And the essence of the book is that maybe your small church isn't supposed to be big. Like sometimes we put so much pressure on churches to grow numerically that we forget that God sometimes puts small churches in places without the intent of them ever growing, but just of them being effective. And that's not necessarily to give permission. Well, you don't have to grow, as much as it is to say, if you're not growing, but you're being obedient, maybe in this season or maybe forever, God has just planted you for a specific reason. And so anyway, I love the essence of that book. And so I wanted to throw it out there as well. It's called The Grasshopper Myth.
That's awesome. We'll link to those in the show notes. That's good stuff. Anything else in there you'd want to add?
Look online. Like we talked about, the internet being what it is, there are so many free resources. So I want to say to small churches, don't create something that's already been created. Don't spend your time. It's not worth it to spend your time. Nick, you have a free resource section on your blog that has a ton of resources. In fact, when I was getting ready to redo some of our forms, and I downloaded a bunch of your stuff because I can modify your stuff in a fourth of the time or less than I can create that same thing. And so there's your blog, but there's sites all over. If you just Google free resources for small churches, you'll find tons of stuff. So don't ever create something that's already been created. Steal where you can, borrow where you have to.
That's good advice. And all the stuff you would download from our free resources was probably downloaded somewhere else and then edited to be.
Yeah.
We do the same thing because I believe the same thing. It's like, even regardless of church size, why reinvent the wheel? You know
exactly.
What I mean? Like you're right. You just save so much time. And now there is a ton out there, which is great. So that's awesome. So how can people connect with you if they want to learn more? I know obviously you're passionate about this and you write about this. So how can they connect with you or contact you if they have any other questions?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. It's Pastor Jared M. And I love connecting on Twitter just because where else can you connect with anybody in the world, regardless of their status and things? So it's a great place to just connect with people. So find me on Twitter. I do have a blog. It's smalltownkidmen.com. And I've recently started putting some new content on there. I had kind of taken a hiatus, but I'm back into creating content for that. And so those are the two places you can find me that I'm most likely to respond is Twitter or my personal blog. But I have a bunch of resources on my blog. Many of them are specific to children's ministry, but not all of them. So feel free to take whatever you want. And then if anybody listening, Nick, when is this going to go live?
We're going to do it just next week, actually. That's not normally how fast, but I think it'd be great to get this out next week. Okay,
so I will be around at some conferences this year. So if I'm going to be at those and you're going to be at one of those, please feel free to connect with me there, because if there's something I love to do, it's to sit and face-to-face talk with people. There's only so much you can accomplish via email, but when you can look someone in the eye and you can really see their heart for things, I love hearing people's stories, and that's something that I really want to do more of, is just listen to your stories and how God is using you. Because I was just thinking the other day, I have yet to meet a person that doesn't know more about something than I do. And so I want to learn from as many people as I can.
That's the right attitude. That's awesome. Well, Jared, thanks for giving us a chance to learn from you today. And, we'll put all those notes and books and everything we talked about in the show notes so people can check that out. And, they can come follow your blog, download those free resources, ask you a question on Twitter if they need to. But we appreciate you taking the time. So thanks.
Nick, I appreciate it. It's a real honor to get to be on your podcast. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Jared. Well, that was a long overdue podcast. Many of you have asked about ministry in a small church setting. So I hope that was helpful to you, even if that's not your setting. Some of the stuff he talked about there obviously could apply across the board. Be sure to check out some of the resources that he mentioned. We linked to them in the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 51. Another action item would be to ask where you're spending the majority of your time and really look at that and then evaluate that, your time and all the things you're doing, and then evaluate and eliminate. Is there something you can eliminate or stop doing because it's not worth the time and it's really something you should save until your church maybe gets larger, and then you can add it on later, whatever that might be. So appreciate Jared coming on the podcast. That was a lot of fun. In next week's episode, I talk with Jeff Henderson, and Jeff and I talk about something new that he's launching to help dads invest in their sons in a unique way. It's really cool. I'm excited about it. It's launching here real soon. So you want to hear about that? Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.